Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Always.
Today, we're tackling something that can be a little tricky. We're going to try to really understand the difference between autistic shutdown and dissociation.
Yeah, two very different experiences.
Exactly. And even though they sound kind of similar, knowing the difference is super important for supporting people, you know?
Absolutely.
So we're going to be looking at this blog post from Cheap ABA, which you might know them. They're all about making therapy more accessible.
Great resource.
Yeah. And in this post, they really break down shutdown and dissociation, kind of get into the nitty-gritty of like what they feel like, how they're
Yeah,
different.
some nuances, right?
Exactly. So hopefully by the end of this, we'll all have some aha moments and feel more equipped to support the neurodivergent people in our lives.
That's the goal.
All right, so let's jump right in. Let's start with autistic shutdown. I think a lot of us have felt overwhelmed at some point, like hitting a wall, but with shutdown, it's way more intense.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. It's like your brain just goes offline.
Can you explain that a little more? Like, what's actually happening in the brain?
Well, think about your nervous system. You know, the part that controls all the automatic stuff, like breathing and your heartbeat.
Right.
When you sense danger, whether it's real or just feels real, your nervous system kind of kicks into gear. It's that whole fight, flight, freeze response.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
Well, for some autistic people, when they experience sensory overload, or maybe they're in a really stressful social situation, that can trigger that freeze response.
And that freeze response is what leads to shutdown.
Exactly. It's like, imagine your brain is getting bombarded with all this input, way too much to handle, and it just slams on the brakes to protect itself.
Wow, okay. So the blog post mentions some specific signs of shutdown. Things like freezing in place, not being able to talk, maybe even withdrawing from everyone around them.
Right. And all those things are basically your nervous system trying to regulate itself. It's in complete overload.
So the person might seem unresponsive, like they're just not there.
Yeah, but it's super important to remember that they're not doing it on purpose. It's not a choice.
It's their brain trying to cope.
Exactly. It's like a temporary system overload.
Okay, so instead of shutting down completely, it's more like hitting the pause button.
That's a great way to put it. They're still there, but they just can't engage in the same way.
This is making me think of those times when my computer just completely freezes up. I have way too many tabs open, and it's just like, nope, can't handle it.
Exactly. And just like with your computer, the best thing to do is just give it time to reset.
So patience is key.
Oh, absolutely. And a calming presence. You wouldn't start shaking your computer while it's trying to reboot, right?
Of course not. Okay, so that's shutdown. Now let's talk about dissociation. This one feels a bit more abstract, I guess.
It can be. But think of it like this. It's basically a mental detachment from what's happening around you.
Like you're checking out mentally.
Yeah, in a way. It's like you're stepping outside of yourself and observing everything from a distance, almost like you're watching a movie.
So instead of shutting down completely, you're disconnecting from the experience.
Exactly. And there are actually different types of dissociation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the blog post talks about depersonalization, where you feel detached from your own body, like you're watching yourself from outside.
Ah,
And then there's derealization, where the world around you just doesn't feel real, like you're in a dream.
that's wild. And I guess memory lapses could be part of it too.
Yep. Sometimes people have trouble remembering things that happened during a dissociative episode.
So it's definitely a different experience than shutdown, even though both are responses to being overwhelmed.
Right. The underlying mental processes are totally different. And this is where understanding the polyvagal theory can be really helpful.
Uh-oh. Sounds complicated.
It's not too bad. It basically describes how our nervous system reacts to different levels of like safety and danger.
Okay, so how does that relate to shutdown and dissociation?
Well, when we feel safe, we're in this state of social engagement. Like we can connect with others and interact normally.
Gotcha.
But when we sense danger, that's when we shift into fight or flight mode.
Right.
And in really extreme cases, we move into that freeze state, which we now understand as shutdown.
Okay, makes sense. But where does dissociation fit in?
Dissociation is kind of in between freeze and fight or flight. It's like your mind can't fully commit to either one, so it just chooses to disconnect.
So just to clarify, shutdown is usually a direct response to immediate overwhelm, but dissociation is more nuanced, right? Like it could be tied to past trauma or chronic stress.
Exactly. The blog post points out that for a lot of autistic people, dissociation can be linked to things like bullying, social anxiety, or even just sensory overload that's built up over time.
So it's like their nervous system has learned to protect itself by disconnecting.
Exactly. It's a survival mechanism.
All right, so we've talked about what shutdown and dissociation actually are And even got a little bit into that whole polyvagal theory thing.
Our nervous systems are fascinating, aren't they?
Totally. But now I'm curious about the practical stuff. Like, how can we actually support someone who's going through either of these experiences? The blog post had some good advice on this, and I'd love to get your take on it.
Yeah, for sure. Understanding is great, but knowing how to help is crucial.
Totally. So let's start with shutdown. If someone's in that state, what's the most important thing to do?
Well, remember, their brain is in total overload, so the first thing is to just create a sense of safety and reduce all that stimulation.
So, like, no need to bombard them with questions or try to force a conversation.
Exactly. Think more along the lines of, like, dimming the lights, turning down any noise, maybe even moving to a quieter spot if you can. It's all about gently removing those sensory triggers that are contributing to the overload.
Makes sense. It's almost like if you had a migraine, you'd want to be in a dark, quiet room.
That's a perfect analogy. And just like with migraines, everyone experiences shutdown a little differently. Some people might need total solitude, while others might feel better if there's someone they trust nearby, just offering quiet reassurance. It really depends on the individual.
So being observant and patient is really important here.
Absolutely. You got to be attuned to their nonverbal cues. Try to understand what they're communicating, even without words.
So what about actually talking to them? Like, should we try to offer reassurance, or would that just add to the overwhelm?
It really depends on those nonverbal cues. If they seem open to touch, maybe a gentle hand on their arm or shoulder could be comforting.
Okay.
But if they're looking away or avoiding eye contact, that might mean they need some space.
Gotcha.
And remember, communication doesn't always have to be verbal. Maybe they can write something down or draw or even point to pictures that represent how they're feeling. It's all about meeting them where they are.
It's interesting, right? We tend to rely so much on verbal communication.
We do.
This is a good reminder to be more aware of other ways people express themselves, especially in those moments when words just aren't working. Okay, so we've covered shutdown. Now, what about supporting someone who's dissociating? I imagine that takes a totally different approach.
It does, and it can be a little trickier, especially if there's trauma involved. In those cases, professional help is always the best route.
Of course.
But for those everyday instances of dissociation, there are some grounding techniques that can be really helpful.
Grounding techniques.
Yeah, things like using a weighted blanket or fidget toys, anything that helps bring the person back to their physical sensations and the present moment.
So it's kind of like gently guiding them back to reality, back into their body.
Precisely. And remember, dissociation often involves those feelings of like unreality or detachment.
Yeah.
So validation is super important. Letting the person know that their feelings are real, that you believe them, and that you're there to support them no matter what.
That makes sense. So it sounds like creating a sense of safety and trust is key in both situations, whether it's shutdown or dissociation.
Absolutely. And communication is still crucial, even if it looks a little different than usual.
Hmm.
The important thing is to avoid making assumptions about what the person's going through.
Right.
Instead, try asking open-ended questions like, what are you feeling right now? Or, is there anything I can do to help?
Gotcha.
And listen without judgment. Let them lead the way. Sometimes just knowing that someone's there and cares can make a huge difference.
It's funny, I'm thinking about all those times when I felt super overwhelmed or anxious, and sometimes the most comforting thing is just having someone listen.
It is.
Not trying to give advice or fix anything, just listening.
It's all about feeling seen and heard. And, it's important to remember that everyone copes with stress and difficult emotions differently.
That's true.
Some people need to talk it out. Others need to be alone for a while. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
The key is to try to understand what that individual needs and respond with empathy and respect.
And I think it's important to remember that these experiences, while they might be more common in autistic people, are something a lot of us can relate to on some level.
Absolutely. We've all had those moments of feeling overwhelmed or disconnected or just completely unable to cope.
Yeah.
Recognizing those shared human experiences helps us break down the stigma and just be more compassionate towards ourselves and others.
This whole conversation has really given me a lot to think about, not just in terms of supporting other people, but also understanding my own reactions to stress.
I love that. That's what learning is all about, right?
Yeah.
It not only expands our understanding of the world, but also encourages us to look inward and connect with our own experiences on a deeper level.
It's interesting, right? We've been talking about shutdown and dissociation as these difficult experiences, which they definitely can be. But I'm also seeing how much we can learn from them, like about resilience and how adaptable our brains really are.
It is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, we tend to focus on the challenges, but yeah, there's a lot to be said for the ways people navigate and overcome these things.
Exactly. It really shows the strength and resilience of, especially the autistic community. And it makes me wonder about the bigger picture. If these are things that happen regularly for someone, how can we move beyond just reacting in the moment and actually create environments that are truly supportive? Like where these situations are less likely to happen in the first place.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the blog post talks about advocacy, which I think is a huge piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, for sure. But what does that actually look like?
Well, I think it all starts with awareness. The more we talk about these experiences openly and honestly, the less stigma there will be.
Right.
Sharing our own stories or the stories of people we love can be so powerful in educating others and building empathy.
So it's about shifting the whole conversation, right?
Mhm.
Instead of seeing shutdown or dissociation as something to be afraid of or ashamed of, we need to start seeing them as natural responses to overwhelm, which honestly a lot of people experience.
That's exactly it. And education goes hand in hand with awareness. We need to give people the knowledge to recognize the signs, understand why these things happen, and know how to respond with compassion.
And that education needs to happen everywhere,
Hmm.
right? Not just within families and communities, but also in schools, workplaces, even public spaces.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine a world where, like, buildings and public spaces are designed with sensory sensitivities in mind, or where flexible work arrangements are the norm, and where social interactions are just more inclusive and accommodating of different communication styles.
That sounds pretty amazing, actually.
Right. It's about creating a world that's truly understanding and accepting of neurodiversity, where everyone feels safe and supported to be themselves without fear of judgment or overwhelm.
I love that. That's a
Well,
world I want to live in.
me too. And it might seem like a big far off goal, but I honestly believe that every conversation we have, every story we share, every act of kindness, it all brings us closer to that reality.
So true. It reminds me that we all have a part to play in creating this more inclusive world.
We do.
Whether it's educating ourselves, advocating for change, or just listening to someone who's struggling, every little thing helps.
It really does. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Huh?
Think about those times when you've felt overwhelmed, stressed out, or even just disconnected or like you wanted to shut down. We all have those moments, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And recognizing that these are shared human experiences can help us feel more connected to each other and more compassionate towards ourselves and others.
That's a beautiful thought.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. This has been such an eye-opening conversation.
It's been my pleasure. And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope you learned something new about autistic shutdown and dissociation, and maybe even gained a little more understanding of your own experiences.
Remember, knowledge is power, and with understanding comes compassion.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep. We'll see you next time.